Hello, this is Eastern Europe Review, the joint production of BELSAT TV and TVP World, with reports and analysis from Belarus, Russia and Ukraine. I'm Sergei Pelesa, and these are the stories. The Kremlin provokes animosity between Belarusians and Lithuanians.
We rarely ask the Lithuanians themselves what the nature of this fear is.
How has Putin managed to create his ideology for Russia?
Let's walk together along the historical path we have chosen.
A Ukrainian village near the Russian border almost destroyed in less than 2 weeks.
There was life, there was community. Now it's empty. All we can see are pits and shrapnel from strikes.
The attitude of Lithuanians towards Belarusians is changing, and not for the better. Following the mass protests of 2020, the number of Belarusians seeking refuge in this Baltic country increased at least 3 times. However, due to the provocations of Russian special services and the Belarusian army on the border, Lithuanians are becoming increasingly wary. How does this tense situation affect Belarusians who were forced to leave their country and seek refuge in Lithuania?
Another wave of tensions between Lithuania and Belarus arose after the death of a Lithuanian citizen in the Horadnia pretrial detention center. On the last day of 2023, a man was arrested at the Belarusian border with about 100 pistol rounds found in his car. The Lithuanian died behind bars 3 months later without receiving consular assistance.
We applied to provide consular assistance, but we were not allowed to see our citizen. That's why there is a tendency to close border crossings. We still keep some of them open, but it's clear that the Belarusian KGB is trying hard to close them too, causing the differences between Lithuanians and Belarusians to increase.
The Belarusian issue is frequently on the agenda of Lithuanian authorities. This year, in the Lithuanian parliament, the Seimas, politicians have discussed the closure of border crossings, the recruitment of Lithuanian citizens by Belarusian special services, and the potential threat to national security posed by Belarus. More than 60,000 Belarusians live in Lithuania, many of whom have fled there to escape repression in Belarus. However, today, many of them fear that despite suffering from the aggression of Lukashenko's regime themselves, they will be held responsible for the actions of Belarusian authorities abroad.
I've noticed a difference in how they treat me and my friends who used to be soldiers in Belarus. They served about 10 years ago and retired as majors, lieutenants or captains. These guys switched careers, came here, got residency permits. Some worked at wargaming, some at EPAM. But today, my friends are being forced to leave. They're having their residency permits revoked, without any consideration for their stance on the war.
Writer Hanna Zlatkowskaja fled to Lithuania at the end of 2020 due to political persecution. Since then, she has observed a gradual cooling of the attitude of Lithuanian citizens towards Belarusians.
We rarely ask the Lithuanians themselves what the nature of this fear is. Some of my friends have indirectly learned the answer. Lithuanians think that Belarus is a huge country. Indeed, Belarus is bigger than Lithuania. Maybe they perceive us as a big neighbor that can swallow their small country.
Russian special services are actively working to spread animosity between Belarusians and Lithuanians, organizing a wide range of provocations. Recently, a photo has circulated in the Lithuanian media showing "Vilnius is ours," written in Belarusian on an entrance sign to the city. Journalists discovered that such slogans are ordered in work-related chats for €50. These provocations aim to convince Lithuanians of the threat of so-called Litvinism, an ideology suggesting that Belarus has a historical claim to part of Lithuania's territory. The groups promoting this ideology on social networks are administered either from Moscow or by Lukashenko regime officials. Meanwhile, trolls on social networks pretending to be Lithuanians are sending threatening messages to Belarusians based in Lithuania. Conversely, Lithuanians often receive such messages from troll accounts pretending to be Belarusians. Analysis of these messages clearly indicates the involvement of the Kremlin.
It's really offensive that all the time we have to prove that we are normal, that we're all against the war in Ukraine.
This week, the State Security Department of Lithuania has announced that there are no organized groups promoting radical Litvinism in Lithuania that represent a threat. Nevertheless, according to the Migration Department of Lithuania, last year more than 1,600 Belarusians were recognized as a threat to national security. Some of them had their residence permit cancelled or not extended, while others were simply denied a Lithuanian national visa.
While independent media and democratic forces were discussing the massive fraud in Russia's electoral process, Russia's Central Election Commission confirmed Putin as Russia's president for his fifth term. Putin responded by stating that the Russians have chosen the path that country would take next. Our next story will explore this path and the ideology behind it.
On Thursday, March the 21st, Russia's Central Election Commission confirmed Putin for his fifth presidential term. However, Novaya Gazeta.Europe uncovered that Vladimir Putin received at least 31.6 million fraudulent votes, meaning that about half of the votes cast for him were manipulated. Journalists employed the statistical method developed by mathematician Sergei Shpilkin. Another independent media outlet, Important Stories, arrived at similar conclusions. However, the Kremlin insists that the election was conducted fairly.
The elections are absolutely fair, and this indicator is at the highest possible level. This fact is undeniable.
Journalists maintain that this year's so-called presidential elections in Russia were the most heavily manipulated in Russian history. According to the Central Election Commission, Vladimir Putin won the presidency with over 87% of the votes, marking the highest recorded result since 1937, when Stalin received more than 99%. Putin naturally expressed gratitude to the people for their unity.
Dear friends, thank you for your support. For me, this is more important than a formal victory in the elections. This is support for the political and economic course of our country, our overall results, which, of course, should be greater, but are already making Russia even stronger and more independent today. Let's walk together along the historical path we have chosen, confident in ourselves, in our abilities, and our future. Thank you.
The nature of this path became clear the very next day after this appeal. The Kremlin used the word war for the first time since the beginning of the ongoing conflict.
We are at war. Yes, it began as a special military operation, but as soon as this group was formed there, when the collective West became a participant in this on the side of Ukraine, for us it had already become a war. I am convinced of this, and everyone must understand this for their internal mobilization. Russia cannot allow the existence on its borders of a state that has a documented intention to use any methods to take Crimea away from it, not to mention the territory of the new regions.
It is generally accepted that the Russian authorities do not adhere to a clear ideology, instead pragmatically employ bright but hollow clichés such as traditional values and anti-colonialism and Russian world that currently serve their interests. However, historian and researcher of ideologies Mikhail Suslov disagrees, asserting that Putinism does indeed exist, and it is much more consistent than commonly believed. It was Suslov who introduced the term Putinism as a scholarly description of the ideological framework of Putin's era.
It would be wrong to understand Russia as one of many other kleptocratic authoritarianisms. We see that Russia is taking risky actions, in particular the war in Ukraine. We see that at some point, ideology, which was created as an instrument of power, itself begins to control this regime and set the logic of its behavior.
The logic of Russia's war in Ukraine aligns perfectly with the ideology of Putinism. Mikhail Suslov notes that this represents the implementation of the idea of confrontation with the Western world and the belief in Russia as a messianic country, liberating the world from Western hegemony. Within this ideology, Ukraine is not considered an enemy but rather a battlefield, not a subject, but a location where Russia clashes with Western forces. The timing of the word war emerging immediately after Putin's re-election is not accidental. It means that large-scale confrontation with the West will be the central focus in Russia for the next 6 years.
Their belief is that there are different civilizations, for example, Russian, Western, Chinese, Indian, and so on. And each civilization has its own set of values, goals for the future, and so on. What's good for the Americans is bad for us.
The researcher is convinced that defeating Putin on the battlefield is not sufficient to eradicate Putinism. Putin enjoys significant support from a large number of Russian citizens. For Russia to undergo a genuine change, democratic forces must offer a more attractive system of ideas than the one Putin has been fostering for the past 24 years.
Since last week, hundreds of shells have struck civil infrastructure in the Sumy region in Ukraine. The settlements on the border are the most affected. Local authorities report the need to evacuate the civilians. The village of Velika Pisarivka, located 8 kilometers from the border with Russia, is enduring daily mortar shelling and airstrikes, leaving it nearly in ruins.
There was a training class here, improvised. Everything was there. But it was destroyed after a massive attack on the center of Pisarivka.
This is how Police Major Artur Kryazh describes the local library in the village of Velika Pisarivka, 8 kilometers from the Russian border. The walls here are all riddled with shrapnel. Dozens of books lie scattered on the floor, and broken windows crunch under the soles of boots.
Until a fortnight ago, children were dancing in the basement, the ones who lived here. There was life, there was community. Now it's empty. All we can see are pits and shrapnel from strikes.
And this is the main street of Velika Pisarivka. It bears a close resemblance to the destruction seen in Bakhmut or Avdiivka, which endured 2 years of fighting. But the Russian army destroyed this village in less than 2 weeks.
Less than a week ago, people lived in this house. The building was fully occupied by residents. They also destroyed the medical center building.
Before the Russian bombardment, the area was home to 4,000 people. Now, according to local authorities and police, only a few hundred remain. The Russian army relentlessly pounds Velika Pisarivka with aerial bombs and artillery, resulting in the destruction of half of the village. The hospital, courthouse, shops, dozens of houses and power lines had been ruined too. There is no light, no gas, no water. The locals who refuse to leave rely on humanitarian aid.
Yes, we do. Everyone takes it, and we take it because there is no electricity, no gas, and we need something to eat. We tolerate it. If there hadn't been any bombardment, then we would be living in this area without light and gas.
Volunteers come here daily to evacuate residents to neighboring towns and villages. Vladislav drove for over 2 hours from Kharkiv to pick up Valentina, whose house had been destroyed by the shockwave.
I saw the red fire approaching. I looked out, and my neighbor's shed was on fire. I couldn't even get dressed. I was shaking. I started to call my neighbors, but they had already been putting it out. I was so frightened. I saw things flying, and it was frightening. Windows were breaking and glass was flying. The most important thing is that we're alive. That's the most important thing.
About 100 residents of border villages in the Sumy region remain in the shelling zone, where transport cannot get through. Some of them refuse to leave their homes, despite the constant threat of shelling.
Let's get all the people in here. Everybody, get inside. There's a threat of an airstrike.
Local authorities have filed papers for the forced evacuation of border villages to prevent further casualties, which already total 35 dead and dozens injured, including children.
These are all our stories for you today. Thank you for watching Eastern Europe Review. Please continue to stay with TVP World.